And I'll just let anyone in who shows up.
Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about some very simple topics, very straightforward topics. Those are heaven and hell, the afterlife, and I'm trying to find the document I'm trying to pull up. Here it is. Okay, there we go. Wasn't set to the top. Here, let's go back to the top here. Okay, there. Heaven, hell, and the afterlife, and the Messiah, and the end times, resurrection and reincarnation. Any one of those would probably be like an hour class in itself. But I'm gonna, and the handout you see is pretty. It's like 22 pages long. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights of what's going on here, and if you want to read more, you can read more in the handouts, and then please feel free to email me if you have questions or post something on my Facebook page or whatever, and I can address questions, or we'll set up a Zoom appointment and we can talk about it.
Okay.
So okay, so let's start with afterlife, heaven and hell. So toward the end of this long outline is our articles from the Jewish Virtual Library, which is a nice general resource about Jewish information. If you Google that, you'll get the URL for it, so you can see all the stuff they've got loaded there. And they have an article on the afterlife and Olam Haba. So the Hebrew expression Olam Haba means the world to come. Well, let me start off by saying something general here. One of the reasons I'm only going to go over this kind of somewhat superficially is because I personally don't think we should get too caught up in the details of the various Jewish beliefs on these subjects. And there's two reasons for that. First of all, Judaism generally does not emphasize the afterlife, as many people know. Most of Jewish thought and tradition is focused on how we're supposed to behave in this world, how we're supposed to develop a relationship with God and create a society that is hopefully just and fair and kind and compassionate. So most of the Jewish tradition is focused on this world, and the speculation about the afterworld is not as important generally. And the second reason why I don't go into a lot of details today on this subject is that what was discussed about the afterlife, in my opinion, is coming from several different rabbis, individual rabbis, who speak, let's say, or whose statements are known from the Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish tradition that was edited around 550 of the Common Era, but maybe in some other Jewish sources and then later Jewish sources. And they're individual opinions of individual people, and I don't think they necessarily are intended to be a systematic description of the afterlife. It's each person's individual conception, and then later, Jews who wanted to reconcile everybody's opinion tried to make all those different opinions fit somehow like pieces in a puzzle. But I don't think they were originally designed to fit together as pieces in a puzzle. They were just individual opinions about what happens after we die. And since they're only individual opinions, and we don't spend a lot of time thinking about it anyways, nobody knows, nobody's come back to tell us what the real story is, right? So these are all speculations. Hence, I don't think it's that important to focus and try and understand in specific detail each individual idea. So that's why I'm kind of going to give you sort of an overview of what the different views are, and you can read the articles to read more about it, and then, like I said, I'm happy to talk more about it afterwards. Okay, so with that all in mind, let's take a look. So there's an article from the Jewish Virtual Library on Olam Haba, which means the world to come, which is generally understood as a spiritual afterlife. When you die, that's where you go. You go to this spiritual afterlife. Sometimes also called Ati Yavo or Ati Lavo, what comes in the future. then there is Jewish concepts of heaven and hell. And here I have an article for you from My Jewish Learning, another website that, again, you can go to, has great information, general information about Jews and Judaism. And they have an article on heaven and hell. And this is kind of what surprises a lot of Jews, a lot of modern Jews. Rabbi, Jews don't believe in hell, do we? Well, it turns out many Jews, probably most Jews, did believe in some kind of fire and brimstone, torturous punishment hell through the Middle Ages. It's not as commonly believed by modern Jews, but it was very popular in Maimonides' day, as we'll see next week. And fire and brimstone. And my guess is that I'm fairly certain this idea was fairly popular in the late Hellenistic Roman period of Judaism, and that's why it entered it. That's how it entered into Christianity as well. So we did believe in a fire and brimstone hell, punishment for the bad people. Nowadays, when people talk about it, or some Orthodox people talk about it, I don't want to speak for everybody, but some Orthodox will say, well, it's not really hell. It's more like a purgatory. It's this temporary place that you go to sort of repent for, or to pay for, or to purify your soul. They might put it in those terms, to purify your soul so that it can then go on to the heaven stage of the afterlife. And that hell is only a temporary stage. What some people might call hell is only a temporary stage before you go to the ideal afterlife. And the amount of time you spend in this purgatory or temporary hell depends on how bad you were in this world. And based on this idea, which again was very popular throughout the Middle Ages in Judaism, even until today perhaps, is one of the reasons, I say only one of the reasons, why some people say Kaddish for their parents for 11 months. All right? According to this view, you spend, if you're really, really evil, you spend 12 months. You spend an entire year in this hellish purgatory, smelting out the bad parts of you so that the pure part of your soul goes to heaven. But since nobody's parents are really, really evil, you only have to say Kaddish for 11 months, and somehow saying Kaddish for those 11 months helps the soul of your parents to get through that time so that they can go on to the better world. Now, I am totally opposed to that view of saying Kaddish for 11 months, but that is one of the reasons sometimes given for doing that. I think, I guess I should say this, the purpose of saying Kaddish for 11 months is so that you can express your mourning and grief and loss, particularly in the sense of when we don't have coronavirus, in the company of other people, because you need a minyan to say Kaddish. So you're forced to be out in the world, in the community, so people can support you during this time of grief and loss. And you're allowed to express it, and you express it through the words of Kaddish, in which you recognize the holiness of God and the wonders of the world he created, even though you have lost something precious from your life. That's my reason for saying Kaddish. And I guess a secondary reason would be it reflects well on your parents, that they trained you, they brought you up right, so to speak, that you have respect not only for them, but for the Jewish tradition, that you care. So it does that. But I have no idea how it might affect their souls, and I think it's personally not a reason why I would say Kaddish, because I think my parents are suffering in some hellish place. In any case, you can read about what these articles say about heaven, hell, and the afterlife. And now we're going to turn to the concept of Mashiach, Messiah. So the term Messiah comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means anointing. And here in chapter 30 of Exodus is the first time this expression is used. It is used to describe the olive oil that is mixed with these fragrant spices that are listed here in the verses in a special blend that created a special scent, right? A unique fragrance of mixing certain proportions of these fragrances in olive oil. And the olive oil was then used to smear originally on the tent of meeting and the Ark of the Testimony and all the holy implements, the menorah and the other implements and the altar incense that went into the tent of meeting. So in order to designate them as sacred instruments, we poured this holy, fragrant oil over them. And that was Mashiach. A little later in Exodus, we then find out that, the same chapter, that Aaron and the priests were also anointed with this oil. And here we have the first person then who is a Mashiach. The first person who is a Mashiach is the high priest, Aaron. Now, I like to analogize this oil to, it's a patented fragrance. Only the high priest and then later the king could wear this fragrance. And so, again, if you were a Monty Python fan and you saw Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is the story of King Arthur and his knights searching for the Holy Grail, there's a scene where he passes by some peasants who are out digging in the farmland with cow stuff all over it, whatever. And they said, he must be the king. So as King Arthur passes, one of them says, he must be the king. And they say, how do you know he's the king? Well, he doesn't have all this muck and guck all over him. I won't use the word they used. Right? So in the ancient world, in the Israelite world, somebody might similarly say, there goes the king. How do you know he's the king? Because he smells like it. He smells like the king because he's the only one who's allowed to wear this patented fragrance. Sort of like Calvin Klein's Eternity, right? In other words, a special cologne that only the high priest and the king could wear. That's what made them Mashiach. That's how they were installed into office, and that's how people would recognize them. And so King David, first King Saul and then King David and King David's successors all become anointed, right? And anointed with this special fragrant olive oil. Encyclopedia Judaica, and I believe this is the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica that I got this from, has an article on the Messianic idea, and it talks about the development of the idea in 3 stages. First, that David and his descendants would be rulers over the United Kingdom of Israel, right? So when the kingdom splits after King Solomon dies, there's 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The prophecies that David's successor would again rule over the United Kingdom are found in Amos, Isaiah, Hosea, etc. That some future time the kingdoms would be reunited and a descendant of David would rule over them together. And then stage 3, Isaiah shifts the emphasis from perpetuity of the Davidic dynasty to qualities of a future king, charismatic and acting with justice. So you can read the verses in Isaiah where he talks about the Messiah having these ideal characteristics. None of the kings of Israel really had all those ideal characteristics. So this is an imagination of a future ideal kingdom. Jeremiah predicts a return from the Babylonian exile. He, remember, is the prophet of the destruction of, who lived during the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the exile of the Jews to Babylonia. He predicts, however, that they will return in chapter 32, that God will, the covenant with God is not over, and God will be with us in exile, and he will cause us to return from exile at some future time. Ezekiel, as I might have mentioned in an earlier class, predicts this restoration with a dramatic vision of dry bones. It's worth mentioning here because it relates also to resurrection, perhaps. I might have talked about this earlier. So he sees a valley of dry bones. God asks him, what do you see? He says, I see dry bones. God says, prophesy over the bones that they should live. And he says, live. And sure enough, the bones rattle together and create skeletons, and the skeletons grow flesh and skin and then are clothed, and he has a standing collection of people in the valley. At this point, let me just stop for a moment and say that, as with all prophets, which we talked about earlier, like with Amos and the plumb line, they all have visions, and I personally do not believe that even when they were describing it, they meant that we should understand them literally. Amos didn't mean
No, I
what?
have a,
That you're waving at me.
I have a question that I sent you, but maybe you didn't
Oh,
see.
oh, I see. It's in the chat. Hold on one second. If the Masorah has in the Mashiach who comes in the future, how can Aaron be a masticated
Well, I couldn't. It didn't. The spelling didn't go. But you said that the Mashiach and the Messiah were the same. If that's true,
Yeah.
how can Aaron be the Messiah?
Well, it wouldn't be Aaron. This would be the idea that there would be a high priest again, and the high priest would also be a Mashiach, who would also be anointed with oil.
I thought the Mashiach was a term that was reserved for the future when we're all doing what we're supposed to do in the world.
Yeah, right. Well, so this what I'm going to explain here is how it came to mean that. But originally, it was just the high priest and the king. What I'm getting to now is you've got these prophecies about a future king, a future restoration of the kingdom that would result in a new Mashiach.
Okay, thank you.
So like I was saying, I don't believe that these prophecies were supposed to be meant to be taken literally. Amos didn't really see an angel standing on the wall holding a plumb line. He saw, in my opinion, the architect or the builder holding the plumb line and noticing that the wall was crooked. But he then described that metaphorically. An angel showed it to me. And similarly here with Ezekiel seeing dry bones come back to life, he didn't actually see dry bones come back to life. He saw probably dry bones out in a field. Some Bible scholars suggest he may have been looking at what was once a battlefield where soldiers had done battle and all died in the valley, and then nobody had gone back to bury the bodies, so the bones are exposed on the valley floor. So he sees that scene, and then imagines the rest of it, right? He's inspired, like all the prophets were inspired, in my opinion, to imagine what they would look like if they came back to life. And then the message that he's supposed to carry back to the Israelites or the Judeans is, you too feel like you are desiccated, dried up bones rotting out in the sun, in the hot sun in a field somewhere, and that you're going to die out here in Babylonia, never to be heard from again. But that's not true. God's going to return you home, and you will be reborn just the way I imagined that those bones came back to life. The Jewish people will be brought back to life in their homeland in Israel. So this was not, in my opinion, and in many biblical scholars' opinion, not a message from Ezekiel that there's going to be a resurrection of the dead, literally, but it's going to be a resurrection of the Jewish people in their homeland, right? A prophecy that was in fact fulfilled in less than 50 years. The Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire, and the Persians order the Jews to return home and Cyrus, the king of Persia, helps to pay for the rebuilding of the temple and the reinstitution of Jewish life in their homeland. So that was the prophecy of Ezekiel, not a resurrection of the dead. However, that's not to say that his vision wasn't later understood by later Jews to refer to a resurrection of the dead. In any case, so Ezekiel predicts the restoration with dramatic vision of dry bones. Isaiah calls Cyrus the Messiah, but clearly in a figurative sense. In chapter 45, verse 1, he calls Cyrus a Messiah, but here anointed one seems to be a little bit more of a metaphoric term, right? Who was the king of Israel, the Messiah, the anointed one? He was appointed by God to be the king of Israel. And so, in a sort of figurative sense, Cyrus is appointed by God to be the one that will restore the Jews to their homeland. He's clearly not from the line of David. He's not an independent Jewish ruler. So, in that sense, he's not Mashiach, but he did God's will, whether he realized it or not, in allowing the Jews to return home and helping to pay for the rebuilding of the temple. Zechariah, in a famous passage that we read on Hanukkah, and actually we just read last week as the Haftarah, has a vision of the high priest Joshua and a king depicted as two olive trees feeding the menorah in the temple, the seven-branched lamp that was used olive oil in its bowls for the fuel, right? So these two olive trees standing behind the menorah with tubes running into the bowls of the menorah, carrying olive oil in them to fuel and light the menorah's light. And the two trees in Zechariah's symbol are interpreted to mean the high priest Messiah and the king Messiah, right? Both of them anointed with olive oil, hence represented by olive trees in his vision. I put Zerubbabel because he is the one who's appointed to be the ruler by the Persians. But in the commentaries, it's not clear that Zechariah had Zerubbabel in mind. He calls the king the branch, which would mean a branch from the tree of David, the trunk of David, right? So he's looking for a descendant of David. I don't know that Zerubbabel was a descendant of David. Might have been. I have to go back and check. But Zechariah may have somebody else in mind to be the king. He doesn't name him, though. Okay, so that's, that's, let's say, the 400s. Now we're going to get to Daniel, which is in 168. The book of Daniel is written in 168. He predicts the end of the Syrian Greek rule. We were under the rule of the Seleucid Greeks from Syria at the time. All right, this is the time of the Maccabees. Daniel is being written at the time of the Maccabees. And Daniel predicts the end of Greek rule and ushering in of the final stage of redemption, the kingdom of God, when all the world will be at peace. Of course, that doesn't quite happen. But when Daniel was written in 168, nobody knew that it wasn't going to quite turn out that way. So along with this idea of a Messiah, there's develops this idea of an ideal future, which we call the Messianic era, the ultimate salvation. Again, this really takes off in the time of the Maccabean revolt, but it also has precedence even in First Isaiah, as we're going to see below. Right, so there'll be this ultimate salvation of the whole world. There would be an era of universal peace and harmony in which God's presence would be felt by all of humanity. A time of peace and tranquility. Even the predatory animals will be vegetarian, just like a return to the Garden of Eden. Right? So in Isaiah chapter 2, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. Or in Isaiah 11, the wolf will lie with the lamb. I'm still trying to find out how somebody changed the wolf to a lion. Haven't found a successful answer to that. If anybody knows, text me. Somebody changed the wolf to the lion, but the Bible is clear it's a wolf. A wolf will lie with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion, and the yearling together. Here it says lion, but not in the beginning verse. Maybe somebody just didn't memorize the verse correctly. Anyway, a little child will lead them. And so how come the predatory animals are lying together with their natural prey? Because the cow will feed with the bear. That is, they'll both be eating straw and grains. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. All the predatory animals are going to become vegetarian. And if the predatory animals are going to be vegetarian, surely humans will be vegetarian as well, and we certainly won't be killing each other in war or for criminal violence, right? We'll all be living in peace and harmony together. The infant will play near the hole of the cobra, and the young child will put his hand in the viper's nest. It will neither harm nor destroy. Right? For the knowledge of the Lord as the water will be as the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And in that day, this is the connection to the Messiah, the stock of Jesse. Jesse was David's father. So, in other words, a descendant of King David that has remained standing will become the standard to peoples. Nations will seek his counsel, and his abode will be honored. So the Messiah will be considered a wise person that people will seek out his wisdom. And similar passages in Hosea. Jerusalem will be the center of religious faith for all humanities. In those days, again, Isaiah 2, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm above the mountains, and all nations shall gaze upon it with joy. And many people will go and say, come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways, and we may walk in his paths. For instruction shall come from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. That's repeated in Micah. So here again, everybody will become monotheistic is the vision. Not everybody has to be Jewish, though. Right? Not everybody has to follow all the Jewish laws, but everybody should recognize that we live in a created world, not an accidental world, and that our Creator wants us to be good and to take care of the planet and the creatures on it that God created. So that becomes part of this messianic vision, what's going to happen when the final Messiah comes. Now, there's also this idea, like as found in the prophet Joel, that this messianic era will be preceded by a war of good against evil. And you probably can Google Gog and Magog. Magog was, this was the battle, the bad guy in the battle, and
the giants.
Yeah, we're going to fight this horrendous battle of good against evil, and good will triumph, and then we'll all live in peace and harmony afterwards. So one Jewish view, not the only one, but one Jewish view is that in order to get to this messianic ideal future, we need to go through this period of war and tribulation. The other version, which is expressed in Maimonides, I think we'll see that next week, is that humanity will naturally progress to greater, more compassionate and just way of life. And as we generally progress in a positive direction, the Messiah will arrive and will rise up out of this new, ever-improving world. And as a leader, will take us to the finish line, right? He'll take us that next step to the ultimate era of peace and prosperity, without the trial and tribulation and the evil battle, against evil. Now, this job description I am definitely going to skip over because it's just a lot of details that I don't think are important. But I stole this from the Wikipedia article on the Messiah, and it's supplemented by SGM. That's me. So it's mostly from what Wikipedia said. And they give you verses to say, oh, this is all the things the Messiah is supposed to do. It's quite a detailed job description. I don't know who would apply for that job. Not going to be any more hunger or illness, and death will cease. All of the dead will rise again. And then I have this little insert from the Jewish Study Bible on the verse from Isaiah that seems to talk about the resurrection of the dead. What the modern Jewish scholars say about that, which is useful to read, I think. The dry bones, but as I said, I don't think the dry bones was supposed to mean resurrection. And then I have a separate article on resurrection below that you can read. Okay, more job description stuff here. Ruined cities will be restored, weapons of war will be destroyed, the temple's going to be rebuilt. Just a word about that, by the way. I should have included in this package of information, there's an article I've read about it a couple of years ago now from the chief rabbi of Israel, the chief, I think, Ashkenazic rabbi of Israel. He was asked by somebody, all right, so the temple, of course, was built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Western Wall is the retaining wall for the Temple Mount that supports the Temple Mount platform. and way down below the western wall, that's where Jews would gather to pray, because we weren't allowed up on the Temple Mount. In the 7th century, the Muslims erected the Golden Dome of the Rock, the shrine, which was placed where they believed the Jewish temple had stood. It was put there by the Muslims in order to sanctify and to mark as a holy place the site of the Jewish temple, because remember that King David and King Solomon are prophets for Muslims, and therefore Solomon's temple is a holy site for them, and they wanted to mark that holy site. And at the time when they conquered the area, it was run by the Byzantine Christians, and the Christians wanted to desecrate it because they saw that as part of the replaced covenant of the Old Testament. So the Muslims wanted to give it respect and honor by building this Dome of the Rock there. But the problem is, it is, and most archaeologists agree, it's pretty much right where the temple stood, up on the Temple Mount. It's a huge Temple Mount, and the building is pretty much right where the temple probably was. So if you're going to rebuild the temple, as that article suggested we're supposed to do, what do you do with the Dome of the Rock? Right? At this point in history, if we tore down the Dome of the Rock to build the temple, I think that would be politically dangerous, hostile, and would cause a huge problem, to say the least. That's I'm underplaying the problem. So you can't really destroy it. So this chief rabbi of Israel said, well, we don't have to destroy the Dome of the Rock to build the temple. That's kind of interesting. He said this. Look, it's a big Temple Mount. We don't have to build the temple exactly where it was before. We can put it next door. And he kind of implied what Isaiah had said earlier. All peoples will go to the mountain of the Lord and worship God. Right? So the Muslims have their shrines. We'll have our shrine. The Christians will have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre down the street. Everybody will worship in the same place. Of course, not Hindus and Buddhists, but the Western religions in any case. So I was just interesting. I just wanted to point that out. This chief rabbi of Israel suggested that as a possibility. Generally, I'm not too anxious to have the temple be rebuilt, because once it's rebuilt, we have to decide what we're going to do there. And Jews today have very, very different and incompatible ideas about what we do there. Right? The Orthodox view, I think, by and large, is we'll go back to doing sacrifices there. 90% of the Jewish world would say that's ridiculous. Sacrifices are way outdated by 2,000 years. Nobody does that. We shouldn't be doing sacrifice. So, so my advice is, we'll wait till the Messiah comes, and if he's able to prove that he's the Messiah and he's able to accomplish the rebuilding of the temple in the first place, I guess we'll listen to whatever he says we should do there. But in the meantime, let's not worry about it. So there's a bunch of other requirements for the Messiah. The Messiah and Rabbinic period is kind of summarized in several blessings that we recite in the weekday Amidah, right? That the Messiah will return, sound the great shofar of our freedom, raise a banner to gather our exiles, bring us together from the four corners of the earth into our land. That's one of the requirements that the Messiah is going to do, return us from exile, restore our judges and counselors. Let there be no hope for informers. The heretics and the wicked people should perish. Here you can insert whoever you want to insert. And it doesn't have to be a person. I always like to say diseases can also be people you hate and want to see destroyed. And so we might want to pour out God's wrath on coronavirus. I don't know. In any case, have your mercies be aroused for the righteous people, rebuild Jerusalem, your city, and establish therein the throne of David. Here comes the Messiah. you're a servant. And then as a separate one, cause the son of David to reign again over the Jewish people. So these are blessings that are found in the weekday Amidah, and they all refer to that Messianic era. So we're definitely going to skip this. Messiah, according to Maimonides, he wrote a code of Jewish law, and in the code of Jewish law, in the section Laws of Kings and Wars, chapters 11 and 12 talk about the Messianic era. It's in the packet here. You can read them, but we're going to read Maimonides next week in a shorter form, and I'm just going to save that till then. So let's talk about what the conservative movement says. I'm going to skip Orthodox and Reform. This is from an article from Wikipedia. The conservative movement text is Emet ve'emunah, which is a statement of principles that were written by leaders of our movement about 30 years ago now. And in typical conservative Jewish manner, we couldn't agree on what to say about our statement of principles. So they gave options. It's like a multiple choice. So some of us believe A, others believe B, some of us believe C, right? So here's what we had to say about the Messiah. Since no one can say for certain what will happen in the Messianic era, each of us is free to fashion personal speculation. Some of us accept these speculations are literally true, while others understand them as elaborate metaphors. For the world community, we dream of an age when warfare will be abolished, when justice and compassion will be axioms of all, as it says in Isaiah, right? We've already read that. For our people, we dream of the ingathering of all Jews to Zion, where we can again be masters of our own destiny and express our distinctive genius. I think this wasn't saying that Jews are geniuses, just our distinctive way of life and tradition in every area of national life, right? It's only in a country where we are the majority that you can really live a full Jewish life. I mean, you can live a pretty good Jewish life here in America because of religious freedom, but even so, the calendar is an American calendar. It's a Western American, somewhat Christian calendar. If you want to take off Jewish holidays in America, it's not easy. In Israel, the Jewish holidays are the national holidays, and everybody takes them off. And that's not necessarily fair and equal with minorities. I imagine I don't know what the rule is, but I imagine that Muslims are allowed to take off Muslim holidays as well. I would imagine that's the case, and Christians can take off Christian holidays as well. But the nation itself operates according to the Jewish calendar because we're the majority, and therefore, although you don't have to ask permission from your employer to take off for the holidays, everybody takes off for the holidays. So that can only happen in one place in the world. We do not know when the Messiah will come, nor whether he will be a charismatic figure or a symbol of the redemption of mankind. In other words, maybe there won't be a person Messiah. Maybe it'll just be a messianic era. Through the doctrine of a messianic... Oh, you have a question, Ronnie?
How would someone prove they are from the house of David?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my answer to that is I can't imagine how they would do that. And so here's my answer to that question. So if somebody was to unite the Jewish people, which is a pretty big trick in itself, ingather the exiles, create world peace and prosperity, and people would look up to this person as being wise and pious, and people would see Israel as a nice place, probably because policies would reflect that in Israel. I'm not going to ask for his pedigree to see if he can prove that he's a descendant of David. He's already done so many miraculous things. I think it's not really it'd be like asking him for his birth certificate. Were you really born in Hawaii? Not to be too political, but I don't think, who would care whether he could prove whether he's the descendant of David when he's done all these other things? That's kind of my view.
When did we lose track of the house of David? How far back
I
can we
think,
go?
yeah. So I think there's one family name now that still claims that their tradition is that they're descended from David. I don't remember which one it is, but I don't. I I don't even. We don't have any. If we found the real burial place for King David, maybe we could do some genetic analysis of the bones, and then we might have some genetic evidence of who is actually descendant of David as opposed to generic Jews. It's kind of far-fetched. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
That's why I don't think we should get too caught up in the details of it. I think the sort of the big picture, first of all, is the most important thing. And like I said, if we end up accomplishing these major goals that seem pretty challenging right now, I don't think anybody's going to worry whether he's actually a descendant of David or not. That's just my opinion. Reform and Reconstructionist Jews generally talk about a messianic era, not a particular Messiah. Maybe partly for that reason. Who's going to prove that they're a descendant? So then we come to the idea of resurrection of the dead. So Ezekiel, as I said, with his dry bones, was not really an argument suggesting that there would be a resurrection of the dead, but Isaiah chapter 60 verse 21 seems to be a statement that there may be a resurrection. Your people are all righteous, they shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands may be glorified. Oh, sorry, no, that's wrong verse. There's a verse above in the material that was quoted from Isaiah that proves that suggests there would be a resurrection of the dead. This idea of resurrection seems to have come about at the time of the Maccabean revolt. And many scholars suggest that it came about because all these righteous, pious Jews who were fighting against the Greeks were dying in battle. And they could not believe that such righteous, pious people, their death would be so tragic and they wouldn't get to see the fruit of their desires, that the Messiah would reign over a peaceful world. So they said, well, there's going to be this time when when the Messiah finally reigns, that the people who died in the past will come back to life, and God will restore their soul to their bodies, will first refashion their bodies and restore their souls, and they'll get to live in this ideal world. And in the Mishnah here, it says you have to believe in resurrection of the dead. It makes it a requirement to believe in resurrection of the dead. And that was what the Pharisees believed. And in the article on resurrection of the dead that's attached here, it says that according to Josephus, the Pharisees believed in resurrection. The other major party, the Sadducees, did not. The Sadducees believed that after you died, that was it. It was the end of your life. But the Pharisees believed in resurrection. The rabbis inherited the Pharisaic tradition. And so when they wrote the Talmud, they said, you have to believe in resurrection. And not only that, you have to believe it's found in the 5 books of Moses. That's what it says here. These have no share in the world to come. One who says that belief in resurrection is not found in the Torah. I can tell you, I've read the Torah a few times now. It's not in there. There is no reference to resurrection of the dead in the 5 books of Moses. But the rabbis found clever ways of reading it into the Torah. And the second blessing of the Amidah refers to resurrection of the dead, saying it over and over again, Tchiat Metim, right? You are mighty forever, you resurrect the dead, sustain the living, you resurrect the dead, right? You bring the dead and restore them to life. You revive the dead, you revive the dead, right? So it's repeated about 5 or 6 times in this second blessing of the Amidah that God resurrects the dead. Why? Because the prayer book, as one of my teachers taught me, was supposed to be the statement of beliefs of the Jewish people for the common Jew, right? For common Jews who don't have time to study philosophy and speculate about God and everything, the rabbis wrote out the blessings to give you the basic ideas of what they wanted you to believe, and they wanted you to believe in a resurrection of the dead. And then we come to reincarnation, which is a latecomer to Jewish tradition. So reincarnation means not that God refashions the body you're in now and puts your soul back into it, but that when you die, your soul, God creates another creature, usually a human being, but sometimes could be an animal, and your soul is put into this new human being, or maybe a different animal, and that's resurrection, right? And that was not at all a Jewish belief until the Middle Ages, as far as I can tell. It enters Jewish belief in Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah. And all I can say about that, and you can ask Rabbi Horowitz to explain it better, because he's studied this much more than I have. I don't understand how the concept of reincarnation fits with resurrection. Reincarnation is very clever, and it's designed to solve the problem, in part at least, it's designed to solve the problem of why do bad things happen to good people, right? So why are you suffering so much now? You're such a nice person. Well, because in a prior life, you did really bad things. And so now you're working through those bad things in the life you're living now. That explains why you're suffering, right? That's at least one of the reasons for people to believe in reincarnation. But if you believe in reincarnation and you believe in resurrection of the dead, right, the obvious question is, okay, at a future time you get resurrected. Which body do you get resurrected into? Like the last body I was in was a bird. Do I come back as bird? Or if you believe that you only get resurrected as human beings, right? So which human body do you get resurrected into? I suppose the answer is the last one you were in, but maybe that's the answer. But anyway, you can tell I'm not a big fan of reincarnation. Anyway, whatever. That's not to say if you want to believe it, that's fine. It's in Jewish tradition, and you can read about it in Kabbalistic literature. Again, that's kind of one of the interesting things about Judaism. We never decided you had to believe one or the other of these kind of ideas. They're kind of all out there, and you can choose, as our movement said, which direction you want to go in. Here's the article on heaven and hell and the afterlife. Oh, heaven, so I mentioned that we believe in, or Jews did believe for centuries in a heaven and a hell. The word for heaven in Judaism is Gan Eden, which means the Garden of Eden. And sometimes that's described in very graphic terms, kind of familiar graphic terms. Everybody's sitting around a big banquet table with all kinds of foods and drinks and lush, whatever, and fragrances and cushions to sit on, and an endless supply of food and entertainment and enjoyment, right? Very physical. Maimonides would have a fit about that, but that's one view, right? It's Garden of Eden because it's describes that lush, beautiful, verdant world, and that's the world you'll be in. And the word for hell is Gehinom, which means the Valley of Hinnom, which was a place where idol worshippers would sacrifice their children to their gods, right? And that's found in 2 Kings 23:10. Yeah. And so in this Valley of Hinnom, which was just outside Jerusalem, like it was such a horrific thing that people would do such a thing that they said, well, if there's a place that's hell on earth, that's it. And so the name for hell became Gehinnom, right? The Valley of Hinnom. Here is where that I mentioned the sentence in Gehinnom is usually limited to 12 months of purgation before it goes to Olam Haba, right? To a good place. 12 months is reflected in the year-long mourning cycle and reciting of Kaddish for the dead, as I mentioned. Okay, so this is Maimonides' long description of the Messiah in his Code of Jewish Law. And this is the article about resurrection of the dead from Louis Jacobs. And this is the article on reincarnation, also by Louis Jacobs. And Louis Jacobs was a British rabbi who was in line to become the chief rabbi of England until he published his book of theology, and the Orthodox world thought he was a heretic, so I kind of took him out of the running. So then he joined our movement instead and became a conservative rabbi in England. Okay, so that's pretty much the material I wanted to cover. It's kind of the highlights. Let me just tell you why I didn't go into a lot of detail on these subjects, because next week we're going to read Maimonides, and it's his 13 Principles of Faith, the essay that he articulates what Jews should believe. We're actually not going to look at those 13 principles per se, but the introduction to them, where he talks about heaven, hell, the afterlife, resurrection, days of the Messiah, and all of those things. He summarizes them all. He puts them in context, and since he's a rationalist, I think he in my opinion, and this is what I'm going to show you, I think he steers you in a direction of a rationalist perspective on this. However, he knew that his audience, Jewish people in his time in the 12th century, adamantly believed in fire and brimstone hell and a banquet of the Garden of Eden and resurrection of the dead and all those ideas. And Maimonides, I don't think, did. So what he had to do was disguise his belief. He wanted to tell the educated Jews, the ones who were enlightened in his day, this is what I really think, but he wanted to do it in a way that the average Jew wouldn't get it, wouldn't see what he was trying to say. So they wouldn't stone him to death, basically, for being a heretic. It didn't work. The people figured him out. They complained that he didn't believe in resurrection of the dead. He was denying a cardinal principle of Judaism himself. He then had to write a whole essay on the subject of resurrection of the dead, where he said, no, I really do believe it, but I think he fudged in that essay also. So there's a raging debate until today among scholars of Maimonides. Did he believe in resurrection or did he not believe in resurrection? And I'm on the side that said he did not believe in resurrection. It does not fit everything else in his worldview, in my opinion. And I'll show you how he kind of fudges it in the article. So that's what we're going to look at next week. And it'll summarize a lot of these issues in sort of a Maimonidean way. Okay, we have time for a few questions, if anybody has any.
I'm perplexed.
Any questions?
Nope. Too much information to have too many questions.
Yeah, it's just.
Oh, sorry.
A little bit overwhelming. Take time to process for questions for me.
Well, that's okay. Maybe after we look at Maimonides next week, we'll have time to write down questions that you have, and hopefully we'll get through Maimonides in 45 minutes.
If I want to write to you, what email?
Oh, S. Morgen, S as in Sam, Morgen,
Right.
Morgen. That's a German spelling of Morgen, at bethyeshurun.org. BETHYESHURUN.org.
Thank you.
Okay, Rabbi,
Yes.
how do you explain people that do past life regressions?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Right, people do have those experiences, and I suppose that's an argument in favor of reincarnation. I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm not an expert in that area, so I guess I can't comment. So I suppose if you believe those things, then that's evidence that happens. So I saw a question here, is there a plan B if the Messiah doesn't show up?
I saw that.
Yeah, the plan B, so here's the thing. That's a good question, and it'll lead to this important point. And so I mentioned that one view is that in order for the Messiah to come, we have to go through this battle of good against evil that's going to be like World War III, and it's going to be horrific or whatever. But the other view is the Maimonidean view that humanity goes in a generally positive direction, maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but that we continue to move in a positive direction until we finally close to world peace, and then the leader arises out of that enlightened world, and leaders, our good leaders take us to the next step, right? So he leads us to this final stage of world peace and prosperity. So the question that's usually asked is, well, which one is it going to be? Is it going to be a bloodbath or a gradual evolution into prosperity? And the answer that usually you get is, well, it really depends on us. If we go about being divisive and hateful and fear-mongering and fighting with each other, that's the direction it's going to go. If we suddenly wake up and realize that we're all one human race, created in God's image, in order to perfect the world and to make it a better place and to protect it, then we end up with the other way. So the plan B to getting the Messiah, if the Messiah doesn't show up, the plan B is we need to make it happen. And hopefully as we make it happen, the Messiah will arise and will take us to that final stage.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good Father's Day.
Okay. Thank you. So really, if you have questions, please write them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Father's Day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
thank you.
See everyone next week.
Okay. Let's see.
I want to see who else is